Let's talk about the general characteristics of the arms, because they work really well in terms of comparing them to the leg. Now, the salient difference between the leg and the arm is that the arm can take on a wider variety of positions because of the way that the joints of the shoulder and specifically the elbow and wrist, right, are structured. So whereas your leg has only, say, about 180 degrees of movement as it goes from frontal or back to profile, either inside or outside, the arm can take on about 270 degrees of movement. So you get a wider variety of positions of the arm, and as a result, the characteristics of the arm start to change in a relatively radical way in some instances. Now, first off, to kind of recap, when we bring this back into relationship with these two main blocks that we're using for the proportions of the pelvis and the torso, when we find this center line, we also find the center of the rib cage, right? And again, the rib cage is going to be kind of nestled into that second box. And this is the same from the back, although we're dealing with the spine. A couple of landmarks that you might want to look for at the top of this center line, right? It's basically two triangles. One triangle upside down, the other one right side up, the peak of which being along that center line, whether or not you're from the front or from the back. It's effectively identical in a really simplified way. This point here is the junction point of your two collarbones, your sternoclavicle cleft, right? So called because you've got two different clavicle and then your sternum. This right here is basically a reference to your scapular spine being the bony ridge along your scapular, aka shoulder blade. As you come up to the top of this, this is basically the top of your trapezius group, these two big triangular muscles on either side of your neck that comprise a much larger muscle in its entirety from the back, but are still visible from the front. What this does is basically gives us an idea of where your shoulder has to kind of lock into. And we're just going to look at it as a simple volume to be in right now, so that we can think about it as basically being halfway inside the torso and halfway outside the torso. And this is so that you think about your arm as being part of your torso as opposed to being separate from it, similarly to the way that we're thinking about the leg as being part of your pelvis as opposed to hanging off the bottom of it. Because when I put in the simplified shape for my upper arm, the simplified shape for my upper arm is just a tube, and the proportion of that upper arm for the tube, or that tube for the upper arm, is the same as the base of your, or the same as your base of your rib cage, right? So that first block in length, and that's going to be exactly the same from the front and the back. And when we look at the arm from a profile, this triangular shape here kind of stacks up on top of the rib cage that's inside of this box, and your arm basically, or this volume of the arm basically sits in underneath that. So it kind of nestles in on top of that rib cage and underneath this triangle. And then the volume of that simplified arm comes down to the base of the rib cage. So the shape of the arm, the upper arm especially, doesn't change, right, regardless of its position, front, back, three-quarter, right, or profile. It's always going to be a simplified tube. And more so with the leg, if I can recommend anything with structuring the arm, less is more. Right? The majority of structural inconsistencies that I see with the arm are by taking this shape and trying to complicate it into something that has too much curve on one side or the other, and as a result, truncates, right, the structure of the shoulder, the elbow, the wrist, etc. Right? We want to solidify this, right, with really simple shapes, because that's going to be the most effective way of doing it. Your lower arm, just like your lower leg, tapers, right, a little bit. Right? And then that wrist is going to be effectively level with the base of your pelvis. Okay, so this overall shape, in terms of a really simple version of an arm, is no different than the really simple version of a leg, other than proportion. Right? That's what your leg would look like. That's what your arm looks like. There's effectively no difference, right, between them. The difference is obviously in the details of what it is that we're putting over top of this, right, and the positions that those details, or the difference that those details are going to take on depending on the position of the arm. Okay, so this is just, right, you know, a quick review rather, right, of what the proportions of your arm are and what those basic shapes are that we're basing everything else on. Now, again, like I mentioned like I just mentioned, we're going to talk about the shoulder more specifically in the second half of the class. But for right now, I want you to think about that upper arm as being divided into thirds. Okay? And your upper arm muscle, right, is called your deltoid, or sorry, your shoulder muscle is called your deltoid. One of your shoulder muscles is called your deltoid. And it basically is this teardrop shape that wraps around this ball from a profile and points towards the middle of the arm and comes down to the 1/3 mark of your upper arm. Okay, so that's a simplification, but it's a pretty decent simplification of what that thing is. This sits on top of all of your other muscles. Okay, so this is the most superficial of muscles. Superficial meaning that it's the closest to the surface. So that same teardrop shape comes down to the 1/3 mark from the front of, if we're thinking about this is the front, from the front of the shoulder, and starts at the 1/3 mark of that clavicle. Now that thing is again attaching to the outside of the arm, so this overlaps that basic shape. It does the exact same thing from the back, except it attaches to the 1/3 mark if we're moving from the medial line as opposed to the lateral edge of the pose. So your deltoid from the back is quite a bit longer than it is from the front, but it still comes down to the 1/3 mark of the outside of your upper arm. So one thing that you can get, or that you can practice in terms of developing the deltoid in your shoulder in general, without having to really think about what that thing is, where it's attaching, what it does, right, etc., right, especially as you start to move into 3 dimensions, right, is to do this simple exercise. Because this thing wraps around the arm, what we can think about that upper arm as being a 3-dimensional tube, right, and your deltoid is essentially doing this. Right? It's just wrapping around that tube. Right? So whether or not I put that muscle in or not, this movement here, as you try to wrap, it's kind of like ribbons around a post. That simple movement there, if you practice drawing that, that will make this feel significantly less clunky, right? Because that's effectively what's happening. Right? If I wanted to detail that a little bit more. Right? And that gives them a sense of 3-dimensionality to that. Okay, so this is just to talk about, what the arm is proportionally and how the arm and the shoulder relate to the torso, right? They're interrelated with each other, right? As opposed to being separate from each other. So give that a quick screenshot, because now we're going to move on to the characteristics of the arm in general. And I'm going to talk about this kind of simultaneously from front, back, right, and the side. Now, one thing to recognize about the arm, that if it's in a straight position, right, with your elbows up at the side and your palms out. If my palms are out, your arm is going to take on this general position. This is because of the nature of the upper arm itself. Your humerus, aka your upper arm bone, looks like this. Right? It has what's called a medial and a lateral epicondyle, right? Which is just fancy word for bulges at the end of the bones. Right? That relationship is always like this, right? Which means that your lateral one is always higher than your medial one. Your outside is always higher than your inside. What that does is that when we force the hand out into a palm out position, is that the angle of your, what are called your ulna and your radius, are forced out. like this. Your radius is your thumb side, your ulna is your pinky side. And so when you find your pinky side, right, this, if you follow the tattoo all the way along the elbow, right, to this bulge right here, that's your ulna. Right? Your radius, right, is your thumb muscle, right? So you can feel your radius, right, the large bulge of it, right, directly below your thumb. The important part of those things is that they get forced out in this direction. So that's why this tube comes, or this tapering tube now comes out like that from that angle. What that means is that this shape, right, is going to take on, or once we've got your deltoid in, that has to go again to the outside of the upper arm. Your triceps, right, your upper arm muscles from the back, and your biceps are going to have a particular relationship to them. So if I look at this same arm from the back, because it's easier to explain this from the back, this basic shape does most of the work, right? And my thumb, right, is still being forced out, forced to the outside. Your deltoid comes across this in the exact same way. Now you can think about your triceps as basically being divided up into two general parts. You have one big bulge right here that sits just below the bulge of your deltoid. That bulge right there is your lateral tricep. And from the front, you can see a little bit of that as it pokes up from in front of the bicep. Your medial tricep, right, you have two of them, one goes underneath the other, basically does this, right, and the apex of those two things bulge, right, lower than the outside one. So that means that even from the front, you're going to be able to see a little bit of that, and it creates, again, a high outside, low inside, which is the exact same thing that we were going over with the leg. Now, you have the exact same sort of relationship with the with the lower arm. And on the lower arm, you have what are called flexors and extensors, right? Extensors are your muscles on the top of the arm, right? These things here, right? They do exactly what they sound like they do. They extend, right, your fingers and your wrist. Your flexors are on the bottom, right? They do exactly what they sound like. They flex your fingers and your wrist. Those things have, right, a predictable relationship to each other. As you come down to the elbow, this junction point here in this position is going to create this angle. Right? So again, high outside, low inside. Right? Similarly to the junction point between the knee and the lower leg, right, with a high back, low front. Your extensors, right, just like this comes down to the 1/3 mark of your upper arm, your deltoid being this, your extensors come up to that 1/3 mark. And for our purposes right now, for simplification, down to the 1/3 mark of your upper arm, or sorry, of your lower arm. And they do so by creating this little tent of shape here. That little tent will look exactly the same from the front and from the back. This is what adds volume to the lower, or helps to add volume to the lower arm, but also what tends to make us think of exaggerating the dip that is naturally created when we intersect this with this basic shape. And this is what people are generally guilty of exaggerating, that changes the structure of things. Easy way of not doing that is think about this space from that 1/3 mark all the way to the end of the hand. Think about that as being one solid shape, right? One long rectangle. And that's going to be the same from the front or from the back. Right? This will get rid of any sort of truncation at the wrist and make this whole area feel solid, even though it feels a little bit clunky, right, at the beginning. Because we can soften that clunkiness by now looking at this inside angle here and then putting a long, slow curve on that until it gets to the base of the wrist. This is representing your flexors. And so the only difference, right, between inside and outside, right, to begin with, is that first off, right, on the top section, right, you can see the triceps. So your triceps are going to look, something like this from the back. You can also see the elbow, And the elbow is going to have some wrinkles over top of it. It's going to have this little wedge shape right in behind here. You're going to have a little bulge of this thing right from the inside. Right? And then you're going to have a long flat section here representing the tendon of your triangle. From the front, your bicep doesn't do anything. Your bicep is basically just a volume inside this overall shape that adds some detail that might be better represented by some shadow, but it doesn't change the profile of the arm at all. Likewise, on the inside, you're going to see like an indentation between this muscle here and these muscle groups here that creates kind of like a triangular hollow in there, but you're not going to really see too much detail in here until we get down to the wrist where you get a couple of tendons. So now the problem with this is that if we twist the arm, right, so that, say that you're moving your thumb towards the inside, all of these relationships, right, start to look different. Because the arm from a position where I start to twist it into a profile, well, now I'm starting to expose a little bit of the side of the arm. I'm starting to expose what this high tricep looks like. I'm also starting to expose the bicep in profile, but I'm also starting to look at this thing here in profile, which means because it starts on the side of the arm and then goes to where the thumb has to be, which is now here, that thing basically disappears entirely in perspective. So what that means is that that lower arm, in terms of its profile, has almost no change of direction whatsoever. Right? And this is, again, why I suggest that, especially with the arm, that less is more. Because here, all this stuff is just this shape. Everything in terms of a detail is internal to that. And it's going to look exactly the same from the inside. Right? The difference being is that if we looked at it from the inside, right, and say that, now we're looking at the pinky edge, what I would be looking at is my flexors. But my flexors would still be inside that chunk of space. Okay? And even with the upper section of the arm, all I'm really doing is adding this little chunk of space here for my tricep. Because my bicep, it does have a bulge to it, but that belly of the bulge is down here, and all of this stuff is tendon attaching those two things together, or your forearm attached or overlapping your bicep from that position. So again, there's almost no change of direction there. And what makes us think that there is a change of direction is shadow that's interior to that information. So while we've got kind of this high outside, low inside relationship and this high outside, low inside relationship, right? Again, although it's at a slightly different degree because of the angle of the forearm relative to the upper arm, it's not quite as easy as the leg is, right? Because of the variety of positions that the arm can take on. So let's take a really common one, for example. We get the arm in an outstretched position, right? And say that the hand is out like that. Well, if we're looking at this from the front, your deltoid now has to still go to the outside of the arm. Your tricep, this tricep is doing this. This tricep is visible from the outside. Your elbow is going to be here, and now your extensor is doing this, and your flexors are doing that. All of that information is being added onto that really simplified shape. If I turn that arm into a position, say like it's Michelangelo's Creation of Man type of thing, reaching out to touch the finger of the Holy Father. Okay. All of this stuff basically stays almost exactly the same, with the exception that this stuff starts to flatten out a little bit, right? Because it's shifting more into a position like that. right? And those relationships would be exactly the same from the back or from the front, with the exception that there would be different interior details attached to them. So let's say that I'm looking at this shape from the back. That basic shape stays exactly the same, except now I'm looking at the pinky side of things. Deltoid's a little bit longer. Tricep now sits here. Elbow is still here, but now the tent of my extensors is there. My flexors are still there. The only difference is that I can't see the bicep. What I can see, right, are triceps, right, and a little bit of elbow. Now the shoulder is a mess, right, and through here, and again, we're going to talk about that a little bit more, particularly in the second half of class. People generally think about the arm, especially the upper arm, as being defined by the bicep. When you have the arm in a bent position, privilege what the tricep is doing. It's a much bigger muscle, has much more volume, and is much more definitive of the arm. So let's say we get the arm in a kind of a classic flexed position from the front. Your tricep is the thing that makes that arm feel big, right? So if I do this, right, my bicep has very little, right, change of direction. Most of the volume of that bicep, right, is internal to that shape. Just a little bit of it pokes up over the edge, right? So this is creating most of that volume. This is adding a little bit to it. So this is the thing that you want to add after. Right? This is the thing that defines most of it. And with the forearm, right, now all of these relationships change depending on its position, right? But what's most important about the junction between upper arm and forearm, right, is making sure that the dip on this side and the bulge on this side is accurate. And if you, again, treat these things simply, that angle of relationship should take care of itself. So this is good. This becomes a problem when you do shit like this, right? Because now you've lost volume inside that area. And this is why I've been saying to some of you, right, please don't do this with your limbs, right? That just causes all manners of problems in relationship to your arms. Okay, screenshot that. So that's not a bad representation of what we're looking to do with the arm. And Ezra, could we fire up your camera and we'll do a 5-minute demo with, say, an arm in a relatively easy position and another arm in a more difficult position. Great, perfect. Okay, so again, none of this changes your gesture. All right, although as we get further in along with this stuff, again, you can have a fair degree of overlap, right, between your structural and your gestural stages. Okay, so I'm not too concerned about whether or not this stuff is accurate. I'm not really concerned about whether or not it's structurally proportionate, right? I'm just putting shit down in terms of movements and shapes. So when I start to build up now, again, trying to base everything on my pelvis and my torso so that, you know, I've got an idea how the upper section of my pose and the lower section of my pose relate to each other. Finding that center line gives me a sense of perspective twist. Also now allows me to start to place where my sternoclavicle cleft and these two triangular structures are, as well as kind of get a sense of like where the median line of my rib cage is going to be. Inside this space, now I'm simplifying the arm, even though, you know, we know all this other stuff, right, about it right now, into this shape. Right? And don't worry about the hand for right now, right? We'll get to it in due course. Likewise, developing an idea of where that shoulder kind of comes out of the torso over here, and then moves up into these two separate shapes Again, simplifying the volume of arm, hand, and shoulder in relationship to each other. Okay, now there's a little bit of stuff that does help, right, structure up the arm with respect to the development of the torso, right? We'll go over that in due course. For right now, right, it's just one of those things that, you know, try and make of it what you can. Now, I can see a little bit of the outside of the arm here, which means that I've got, right, a three-dimensional shape that I'm dealing with. Just like with your leg, your upper arm is just this shape. Right? And if you can find the center line of the outside of that shape, then you've got a rough idea of where that deltoid has to come down to that point. And you also have a rough idea of the overall volume and contour of that area. So that now, over top of that contour, I can put in a little bit of a curve for that little bit of the tricep I can see from that side. And then here, I put in a little bit of a bulge there. But you can see I'm hardly adding anything to that as a way of making that feel a little bit more army, so to speak. Same thing here. This slight bulge here is an addition to, right, this basic shape there, as is this curve here. Right, so all of that is basically building on this basic shape and adding to it. Right, I'm not digging into this. What I'm trying to do is maintain volume here, so that when I do come down to the hand, right, that hand starts to feel more accurate because the volume of the wrist that's already present. With this arm, it's much the same thing. Right? The deltoid has to go to the outside of the arm. Right? So again, practicing drawing that shape is very helpful. Defining characteristic of the upper arm being the tricep. Again, there's an interrelationship that we haven't gone over and won't for some time, right, with the deltoid, the pectoral, the rib cage, right, and your back muscles, right? For right now, this defines the upper arm. And you can see here is, like, again, the belly of the bicep is inside and to a great degree inside the upper arm. The junction point of the elbow, that's the most important part of it. And if we've got this natural, if I've got these two shapes overlapping each other, that'll happen quite naturally. Your flexors are more visible here, right? You can think about those as just being a volume and then contribute to that volume by putting a little bit of a curve on the outside and then maintaining the volume from here out to here. So that when I come in and put in a more developed hand, all of that stuff is already based on something that ties the wrist and the hand itself together. Okay, so the idea again is to go from something that looks kind of clunky and shitty to begin with, right, and add what's necessary rather than, you know, starting afresh, so that you can get into something that, you know, to be fair, is a pretty complicated thing. Thanks, Ezra, that was great. And then use that as a guideline, right, for anything that is going to resemble the detail that goes in on top of that. Okay, and this is going to be pretty consistent for the way that I'm going to basically approach everything, right, in this course from this point on, right, is using these really simple things, right, as a way of providing a guideline for more complicated things. Questions before we move on? That's a fair amount of me talking.
So the sorry, I do have a question about the extensors. They basically just ram right into the elbow, and you just draw them as a gradual slope. That's pretty much the takeaway for those ones.
Sort of. Just think about, here's your upper arm and here's your elbow, right, from the back. There is your lateral epicondyle of your humerus. One extensor comes up, right? So let's say that arm is coming down like this. One extensor comes up and attaches here, and it goes all the way down to your thumb side. All of the other extensors attach there, right? And then gradually start to migrate across the arm like that, right? So they don't really ram into, right, the elbow. This one here overlaps the elbow, right, and overlaps the elbow, and then everything else starts there. So a really common position of the arm, for instance, that illustrates this really well is this, where you have, say, a hand that's kind of bent like this, and we're looking at it from the pinky side. Well, your elbow, right, becomes pretty easy to deal with, right? And that elbow, right, so this bone here, again, has to be attached to that bone there, right, is basically divides or basically attaches there like that. And that forces all of your flexors underneath here. Now, what you'll be able to see from the profile, right, in a position like this is this bone kind of pushing up against the surface of the skin. That's that thing right there. This big muscle here starts here and it comes down like this, right? But then all of your other muscles do this. They slide over top of that and then gradually move down towards the middle of the arm. Okay, so it's not so much that they kind of like ram in, they all connect here, right? But also up here. I'm not sure if that clarifies or confuses things.
No, that's cool. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. In every instance that we're talking about, right, with the, different sections of the body, there's always an overlap between lower arm and upper arm. There's always an overlap between pelvis and torso. There's always an overlap between upper leg and pelvis. There's always an overlap between upper arm and torso, right? There's never one thing that's separate from another. They're always interrelated. And this is a big part of why that gestural and that fluid and simplification stage is so important, is that it takes really complex shit like this and simplifies it, right? So that it's a user-friendly version that you're able to put down inside of a short period of time, but then also that you can build up on effectively, right, with more complicated stuff, right? Because the basic relationships are already there. Okay, well, let's give that a go and see what we can make of it. Now, just like we've done with the legs up until this point, what I'd like you to do is gesture and basic structure first. And then, but then when you start getting into like these more specific details that we've just gone over, let's start focusing on the arms first. And then if you've got time left over, go into the legs. And Ezra, if you can control your poses so that there's a limited degree of foreshortening with the arms, or maybe even no foreshortening, right? But bent positions and straight positions, right, et cetera, with the arms would be great. Awesome, thanks, man. Okay, gang, away you go. Fives, yes, please, thank you. Okay, so as I mentioned at the beginning of the course, or near enough to the beginning of the course, right, what we're effectively doing is, going over stuff, right, that makes the body, right, more effective to understand. But we're also going over stuff that makes it more efficient in order to put that stuff down, right? And as a result, you kind of increase the consistency of your drawing. So it's not like you guys aren't going to be creating good drawings, right? But the way that it was described to me years ago was that, you might have at the beginning, say 1 out of every 20 drawings that you're happy with, or 1 out of every 10 drawings that you're happy with. And then gradually through consistency and developing knowledge in the mechanical skill, that ratio starts to narrow until it's like 1 out of 4, 1 out of 2, right? And, ideally a 1-to-1, although that never happens. So you just have to take my word for it. Right, so this process helps in that a lot. So at the beginning, we've got the gestural phase, right? Where we've got movement, line of action, hip and shoulder axes, your squash and your stretch, right? And then, to a limited degree, basic shapes. Right? And then building on top of that, we're effectively taking the basic shapes into this, right? And then establishing proportion, and then redefining those basic shapes in terms of their basic relationships, right? So what does an arm look like? What does a leg look like? What do those things always do? And what are the shapes that are associated with them, right? So if you want to think about it this way, this is what your 30 seconds are all about. These are what your 2 minutes are all about, but they're building on top of this. Those things lead directly into that. And then kind of like blithely and obliquely, I mentioned that, you know, there was a third stage that, you know, I was just kind of like leaving as a question mark, and that eventually provided yet another another stage of development in between here and your details, right? And your details being silhouette line, interior detail, value in terms of shade and shadow, and any sort of mixture of those things. Well, one way of thinking about this intermediate stage, right, is first off thinking about, say, what's possible inside 5 minutes before we get into this. And just like there's crossover between here and here, there's crossover between here and here, and there's crossover between these areas. So again, these are things that are useful to think about in terms of development, as opposed to like this regimented hierarchy of the way that you need to approach a pose. So one tool that we can introduce here, right, in the service of getting into, say, more developed anatomy is what's called blocking. Now, blocking basically is taking curved lines and turning them into straight lines. That's a simple way of thinking about it. And the rationale behind doing this is that it's very difficult to make straight lines accurate as they actually come to represent something. There's no trick to making a curved line, right? Making a curved line is fine, right? That's easy, or that's easy enough. It's very difficult to make that curved line actually represent something and have it be in the proper proportion, the proper position, and the proper degree of accuracy. So what I mean by that, for instance, is that I can make a gestural leg quite easily. I can make that proportion quite easily. I can even put in this simple curve quite easily as a way of representing those relationships that we've gone over. But it's very easy to do this with that curve. It's very easy to do this with that curve, right? This exaggerating the structure in one way, this exaggerating the structure in another way. So as a way of getting around this, what we can do is essentially look at where the apex of that curve is and think about that curve from, say, its start point to that apex as a straight line. And then think about that apex to its end point as another straight line. And when we put those two straight lines down and identify where that apex is, the only thing that's really left over between turning this curve or these two straight lines into a curve is softening that point there when we've got a little bit more time to do so. Right, so this becomes a useful way of putting in things like, say, when we were dealing with the simplified version of a tricep. Rather than putting this tricep in like that, another option is to put this in and then put that in and then soften that curve after the fact. Right, this is another way of, say, approaching, say, a volume. Right? Rather than rolling in the volume of a bicep the same way that you would roll in the quote-unquote volume of an elbow, I can put in that volume by blocking in those individual shapes and making them seem like they represent that area, right? But they represent that area in a slightly different way. Now, the value of doing this, right, is twofold. First off, we've already gone over. It makes curves easier to hit. What it also does, though, is it starts to introduce a different way of detailing the pose without really thinking about detailing the pose. So what I mean by that is that certain lines are going to be more representative, more expressive of certain areas in the pose than other kinds of lines. So again, to go back to this, a curved line is much more representative of what the outside of the leg feels like, say, at the calf. But a straight line is much more representative of what the inside of the leg feels like, right, at the shin. Simply because a straight line better characterizes the stiffness, right, of bone, right, and the tension that that bone tends to carry. Now, when we add in, right, this little peak, right, for the calves on the inside of that, likewise, those two straight lines better characterize what that muscle looks like from the front than two curved lines, right? So there's a big difference between a calf that's being put together like this and a calf that's being put together like that. Both are going to have the capacity to convey structural accuracy. Both are going to feel very different. So this becomes another way of starting to develop a pose in terms of its detail, right? Without necessarily thinking about detail in a more intuitive way, which is these types of ways. This also becomes a way, oddly enough, a way of expressing the pose differently. Right? So for those of you who are into graphic novels, comic books, right, especially, and especially those of you who are interested in, say, like the way that male superheroes, right, are detailed as opposed to female superheroes, or this is increasingly less and less the case. Right? Male superheroes are generally characterized, right, by blocking in their muscles, right, like this, because it makes those male superheroes feel much more rigid, much more stable, much more solid, as opposed to round stuff that makes everything feel much more fluffy, right, and approachable. So we can take the exact same sort of information and start to detail it in different ways with different line value, and as a result, come up with a different expressive value attached to it. Okay, so there's a twofold aspect to this, right? There's a kind of methodological aspect to this, but there's also an expressive aspect to this, not only in terms of communicating things that actually exist in the body in a slightly different way, bones, points of compression, points of tension, right, but also in an expressive way in terms of what you might want to achieve, right, with different kinds of presentation on an emotional basis. So Ezra, could we fire up your camera again, right, and take any old pose if you'd like. And I'm going to introduce this in a methodological way in one demo, and then I'm going to do another demo where I'm just kind of using this as another tool amongst many, just like I was doing those 2-minute demos that kind of have like bits and pieces of what we're going over, right, but also, and more importantly, bits and pieces of stuff that we're going to be doing or stuff that we can add to this. Okay, so again, and importantly, none of this stuff affects your gesture. Gesture remains the same, blah, blah, blah. I need this as a way of then starting to develop on top of this. So the more simple, the better. The more fluid, the better. And the more that we can combine things into single shapes, also the better. So now over top of this, this also doesn't affect your gesture, although again, there is crossover between the two. Or sorry, it doesn't affect your basic structure and proportion, although there is crossover between the two. Right. And basically using this as an approach to start to make this, again, as easy as possible, depending on where it's applicable. Right, but in some instances, just like everything else that comes out of my face in this class, right, this blocking stuff is going to be more or less useful depending on the context with which you're surrounded or with which you're faced. I've been doing a lot of writing over the last couple of days, and as a result, my syntax has become very formal. It's weird how that works. One thing affecting another. One art form affecting another. Okay, so all of this stuff, right, is a version of those basic shapes, basic proportions that we've essentially been doing. Now, an intuitive way of moving forward from this, right, one way, right, would be to take those more specific relationships that we've had, right, start to change them around, right, and layer those in. And this is great. Right? This is definitely something that you should be thinking about, right, and something that is increasingly important. But another way, right, and another way that we can start to think about developing the poses now, rather than just jumping from one stage or another stage, right, into a final stage, is that now I can start to block in, right, anything that resembles a curve with these more straight lines and help them act as another guideline towards developing a more accurate pose. And sometimes those things are going to end up being finishing lines. Right? So for instance, when I come over top of the bone of the elbow to the wrist, right, or the back of the hand, those are going to be particularly useful lines as a way of starting to establish that area, right? Because those areas are going to have more of a bony presence to them. Other areas I'm going to want to soften as I go forward. Okay, so again, just like everything, sometimes I'm going to be using these or this approach. Other times I'm going to be moving directly past it because it's not going to be particularly useful for what I'm doing. And how you know the difference rate between the two is ages and ages of experience and piles of frustration heaped on piles of other frustration, right? Until you've experienced enough of it that you know what pitfalls to avoid and which ones to take on. Okay, so this is a very formulaic way of using this, right? In the sense that, I'm basically going through every single area of the pose and treating it with the same sort of attention. Generally speaking, I wouldn't be doing that, right? But demonstrations being as demonstrations are, a demonstration you shall get. Okay, so now over top of this, now I might be in a position to make more specific shapes, but I don't have to, or more specific details, but I don't have to necessarily go in and draw over every single line. I don't want to go over top of this and smooth it out because this is bone pushing up against the surface. So I want to keep that relatively light or relatively stiff. This, however, is rib cage, right? And that rib cage has a nice curve to it, which moves nicely into the curves of the oblique and lower back. So maybe I want to accentuate those curves and soften those block lines, right? This is muscle, fair, right? But it has a nice stiff feeling to it, right? And as a way of making it feel more stiff and more solid, as well as that rib cage, I can accentuate those straight lines. Although I could keep them at the same straight line, right? But at a light level and make it feel the same way, although lighter. Likewise with this arm, I don't necessarily want to do anything to this arm here, right? Because that already feels the way that thing should feel in terms of maintaining a certain level of stiffness. If anything, what I might want to do is just come in, right, and start to darken that stuff. And what should hopefully become, apparent as I'm doing this, right, is that not only do we have different kinds of lines, we have different kinds of densities as well attached to this. And as a result, things start to feel, right, and importantly, feel more different, which means that I'm not just doing this over top of the line, which is, again, a natural way of thinking about finishing the pose. It's just making whatever you've done darker and doing it with a whole bunch of little squiggly lines. What this does is it kills the expressive value of any line. And what we want ultimately is to make the drawings look a little sexier, right, by having not only accuracy, right, but also, right, a certain level of control and flair that goes over top of that. And this is true whether or not we're talking about edge line, right, structural lines, right, or even lines that are helping to contribute to the sense of value that's being developed inside of a picture. Okay, so basically this is just a long, typically elaborate, right, way of me explaining something relatively simple to say. The kinds of lines that you use in terms of the process that you use is just as important in terms of, as opposed to what you're describing. Ezra, I've got a feeling that that's either a really long 5 or that's just longer than a 5, right? Which I appreciate, which means that we won't do another demo, right? Because I've basically done 2 things at the same time.
Yeah, I just took the pose. I didn't put time on that one, so.
You sons of bitches. You son of a bitch. All right. Well, with that being said,